Hi, Father Ian Van Heusen here. So I want to get into this question of, is Jordan Peterson going to hell? Um, Based on a commentary on St. Alphonsus Ligouri and his teaching on conscience, and particularly the difference between invincibly erroneous conscience and an invincibly erroneous conscience. So we're going to kind of flesh that out. So why did I pick Jordan Peterson? Well, first of all, because it's clickbait, and so you're paying attention a little bit more. But I also think right now he represents a certain kind of person, which is a good test case that opens us to the possibility of mystery. So Jordan Peterson, in many regards, believes in a fairly traditional morality. He argues against pornography. He argues against masturbation, I think. He argues for almost a traditional sexual morality. He argues for Western civilization. And there's many things I would say 99.9% of what he argues seems to be in line with church teaching. Now, we can't say for certain. I think I haven't read everything he's written and gone through everything he's created. But I would say that there's a good chance that we have in Jordan Peterson something similar to Aristotle and Plato, which is we have somebody who is obeying their conscience and has arrived at many of the truths of the faith and seems to have a well-formed conscience, but they don't have explicit faith in Jesus Christ. And so they are violating certain aspects of the divine law, which is, so for example, part of the divine law is to offer proper worship and to recognize the proper role of God and to believe in God. And that's part of our salvation is through a relationship with Jesus Christ. But I think we're going to use this as a test case to kind of flesh out this idea of an invincibly erroneous conscience. But let's first get back into the text. So we're on page 25. So St. Alphonsus says, furthermore, conscience is divided into right, erroneous, confused, scrupulous, doubtful, and probable. A right conscience is that which dictates the truth. That's what we want, a right conscience. That's the gold standard. Therefore, one sins if they work against it. Since the apostle says, everything which is not of faith, namely from the dictate of conscience, as Estius and others explain, is sin. So Romans 14:23, he says that's how he interprets it, and other authorities interpret that passage from Romans. Innocence the Third confirms this in his an encyclical. It's kind of a lot of abbreviations, so I don't want to get into that. You can look up the book. This is the book, Moral Theology by St. Alphonsus Ligouri. All right, so Innocence confirms this when he says, whatever is against conscience paves the way to hell. But an erroneous conscience is that which dictates what is false as though it were true. So we have an erroneous conscience. Moreover, some erroneous consciences are vincible and some are invincible. A conscience is vincible when it may and must be conquered by the operation, or because it notices an error or at least hesitates about an error, and at the same time notices the obligation to conquer it, but does nothing to conquer it, as many teach. So some people would say, well, if I obey my conscience, I'm fine. But what he's arguing is that if you're aware that your conscience is malformed, and you have an obligation to, one, seek to correct your conscience and to have an informed conscience. That is if it's a vincibly erroneous conscience, which is that you have a reasonable understanding that you need to change your opinion. That you have, perhaps let's say, for example, a Catholic who says, it is appropriate to be pro-choice or to have an abortion. And then they're told by a rightful authority that that's wrong. They have an obligation to change their conscience in accord with the authority. That's probably a little bit more of a controversial one, but there might be other ones that aren't as clear and direct as that. So keep going on. So he by the way, he strings together a lot of citations. Not that he's just citing people and it's kind of a lot of names and numbers. So it's a lot of classic folks of casuistry, things like Suarez, St. Antoninus, Navarrus, the Salamancans. And will spare you the history and all of the neat stuff that gets beyond it because it's kind of heady and just kind of, and I'm actually not that well versed in it. But okay, let's jump around. So let me get back here. As many teach. So some argue, so you list together a bunch that argue that it is not necessary to apply oneself to the utmost so as to conquer error. Rather, it is sufficient to do what is common and ordinary. So I think he agrees with that. So you don't have to necessarily go out of your way to conquer an erroneous conscience. You just have to do your best and within ordinary circumstances. And I think ordinary circumstances would be things like consulting a priest or consulting. But for example, let's say you had a case of conscience where you felt like you were being erroneous and you consulted a priest or a priest that you trusted. You wouldn't have to go out of your way to research all of the possibilities and really extend yourself. You could just kind of trust that authority. So on the other hand, and this is going to be where we come into with the whole Jordan Peterson thing, an invincible conscience is such that cannot be morally conquered, since no thought or doubt comes into the mind of the one who acts, nor even confusion while he acts, or when he considers the cause of the action, as explained in greater length in the Treatise on Sins, Book 2, where it is argued on the knowledge that is required for sin. From what we say, someone has a vincibly erroneous conscience that always sins when he acts either according... Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second. So where we really need to... This teaching can kind of open us to mystery, is the way it's kind of set up is there's a vincibly erroneous conscience and there's an invincibly erroneous conscience. And the question then becomes, how do we distinguish between the two? I would argue we want to always read these teachings in the context of mystery. So in the case of Jordan Peterson, that he doesn't have an explicit faith in Jesus Christ, that he's not offering proper worship. The question is his conscience invincibly erroneous or simply erroneous and should be conquered? And I would say this is where each one of us, in weighing individual cases, we need to be open to the possibility of mystery. So on one hand, we always want to, an orientation towards evangelization. We always want to help people to come to an explicit faith and to live well. But we also want to rest in the reality and the possibility that there's an invincibly erroneous conscience. I don't think actually, I think what this reality does is it doesn't necessarily make it so that we have to have a super rigid or super explicit judgment one way or another in these individual cases, but kind of hold these, in drawing in de Lubac and other theologians, holding these two principles in what is called a paradoxical tension that allows us to be open to mystery. So when we're working with people, helping them to form their conscience and to conquer their erroneous conscience, but also being open to the possibility that it's invincibly erroneous. I think this is the way that we can work in the world towards evangelization, but also have peace within our hearts. So let's get into the rest of it, just kind of the rest of the commentary. From that we say, someone has a vincibly erroneous conscience that always sins when he acts either according to it or against it. So if somebody is able to conquer their conscience and they recognize they're in error, if they obey their conscience, they sin. If they go against it, they sin. He sins in an act against it by choosing the evil that he judges to be evil. But he sins according to it in an act because although it ought to be an error and can be conquered, he carries out the work rashly by not laying it aside. So this is an important quality. So when our conscience judges whether something is good or evil. So we really need to obey our conscience. I think where this can open us up to a possibility is, let's say somebody says, like I tell somebody they need to do something, or an authority like a priest, and they say, but they still don't believe it's their conscience hasn't been corrected. They still believe it's wrong, but they say, well, I'm just going to do it anyways because Father says. They're still sinning. They need to really conquer and have that certainty, that internalization where they accept that it's true, and they come to that conclusion. At least that's how I'm reading it within this context. Again, all of this, I think, is really not so much to make us rigid or to make us, but really to open us to the possibility of mystery. So hopefully, as I've meditated on this with you and I've reflected on it, this teaching can kind of help you to appreciate that sometimes there might be somebody who might appear to be sinning or might appear to be in error, but there's always the possibility that because of their conscience, that they are doing what is in fact correct according to their conscience. We're going to get into, I know there's probably going to be lots of objections. There's obvious ways that some of this teaching can be abused. But at least today, rest in the fact of mystery, the possibility that God looks into the heart, and maybe we don't always understand why other people do what they do.